Okay, this is lecture 4.2 in Implicit Bias in Policing. We are going to be talking about how this factor known as implicit bias may impact the way police actually do their jobs. So first we'll talk about and reflect on, in kind of a personal way, how police treat you. And then we'll talk about Weber's concept of ideal culture and real culture and how that relates to policing. And then we will talk about how this phenomena of implicit bias applies to policing. So let's talk about how police treat you. Different people are treated by police differently. And this is not because all police are horrible people. It is because they're people. And some people are horrible. Many police are great. Many police do great things. Many police are the community heroes that they want to be and that we all want them to be. But there are some people who are police that are bad and racist, and that's a big problem in our society, and every society, really. Personally, me, your instructor, I have a history of negative interactions with police. I have known very good police officers, but my personal knee-jerk reaction is that of mild hostility toward police. And part of it is my demeanor. I am the kind of person that asks questions when I'm in a situation. I am the kind of person that likes explanations. I do have problems with authority. When someone tries to tell me what to do and I have a disagreement with them, I am likely to try to bring it up. And those are all behaviors in the general public that many police don't really like. Police in general don't like these qualities in how I respond and when I exhibit them, right? So as a result, they don't like how I'm talking to them, and thus I will take certain subtle stances in responding to them. And thus my next interaction with police may become more hostile, right? And thus the cycle continues. Once an individual, like me, like other people, once we start into cycles of behaviors, they can get more and more and more intense, right? Because, well, I've been treated like this in the past. I think I know how I'm going to be treated in the future. Let's see what happens here. Why am I telling you this? Well, all of us are people with past experience impacts our present behavior. If we have had bad experiences with police, those may feed into future bad experiences with police that we are bringing in on a subconscious level, right? If you're afraid in a situation, you will act afraid. And if you act afraid, a police officer, especially one that isn't that veteran, may perceive that as, well, what are you afraid of? Do you have something to fear? Or if you're a person who has had only good experiences with police, you may have a hard time understanding those of us who have had bad experiences, right? So you may have a hard time understanding why anyone would say police are a certain way. Well, because in their lived experiences, they have acted in that certain way. Similarly, on the side of the police, if the officer has had a bad experience in a given situation or a given neighborhood, when they are called back to that area, they may be primed for hostile or fearful behavior, right? And if someone who is set up to be afraid in a situation or think they might get hurt in a situation, they may act in a way that is not beneficial for anyone. So police, I will say this over, police are people too. We can't forget that, especially those of us if we are critical of police. Then when you layer onto that factors like race, like class, like other social constructs, these can aggravate these tense situations in which we have had these emotional moments in given situations and then aggravate it, sorry, and make it so much bigger. So in our society, we greatly value equal opportunity. And the vast majority of us, that should say think, sorry about not think. The vast majority of us think discrimination is bad. So in an ideal culture, police should treat everyone equally. We all believe that. That is something that we value at our core as members of a society, that police should treat everyone equally. Those who are critical of the police because they believe police should treat everyone equally. Those who like the police because they believe that the police are trying to treat everyone equally. So this is something we all share. The reality, though, the real culture is what happens in a lot of areas is that if you are a member of a certain marginalized group, police might treat you differently than if you are not in those groups. And this can be really hard to believe if you're not the type of person to get profiled. This is really exemplified by the fact that we didn't even talk about racial profiling. We didn't talk about police brutality. We didn't talk about any of this stuff, hardly at all, prior to the 1990s. The very first big documented case of this was the Rodney King beatings in Los Angeles in the early 1990s, when someone had a videotape and recorded police beating a man. Prior to that, namely, a lot of white people didn't know that was even thing that could happen. Black people who had been living with these situations, with these deeply troubled police forces, again, not all police forces, but some police forces, namely those in Los Angeles in the 1990s, Black people knew about it. White people didn't really know about it, right? So that was the issue there, is that there was no proof, and white people wanted to see proof. And the reason that they wanted to see proof is because it was so outside of their lived situation. And that's part of the reason why groups like Black Lives Matter took off so dramatically in the 2010s, is because so many more people had their video recorders, their phones, and they were able to take pictures. And they were able to take pictures of what was happening right here, right now. And the evidence for the general public became overwhelming. Let's talk about implicit bias in policing, because this is what it comes to. This is where all this stuff comes from, is this phenomenon known as implicit bias. So the problem of police brutality is so much greater than individuals or local police departments. It's a structural issue. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Structural issues such as police tactics, those addressed above, those that we talk about in this unit, those are a real big piece, but another piece is implicit bias. So implicit bias is our subconscious tendency to treat people from different groups differently. You can call this prejudice, and these are prejudices we're talking about, but implicit bias is the mechanism of prejudice. So you can have implicit biases based on race. You can have implicit biases based on class, ethnicity, regionalism. You might have attitudes and treat people from the American Southeast differently, or wherever differently. That's called regionalism. Sexism, gender, sexuality, religion, or almost any way that humans can be categorically different from each other, we can hold implicit biases against those kinds of people. We do not all possess all implicit biases, but you might have some. You probably do have some. You probably have some biases that you are subconsciously aware of. Put in a different way, there are a lot of people that are not aware that they are racist. But if you want to know, if you want to explore that bit about yourself, you can explore implicit bias on your own. There are a number of very good implicit bias tests available online. The best ones are through Harvard. If you search Harvard implicit bias tests, you can get some really good ones there. And once you figure out what your personal implicit biases are, you can fix it. And that's really great. We call that extraordinary examples. So if you find you say have an implicit bias against Native Americans, something like that, and you don't like that about yourself and you want to fix that, then you could go to a talk by Alexi Sherman, or you could read books about Native Americans from their perspective, or you could see some documentaries made by Native American filmmakers. You seek out those extraordinary examples, and then that in your brain, and this is so remarkable because it doesn't sound like it should be this easy, that will negate the bad feelings you have, the bad implicit bias you have in your brain. And then if we are able to test you later, we will find that that implicit bias has diminished, which is really remarkable in terms of social science. Usually we don't have that kind of quick fix thing. Now, how this relates to police is that some police forces have engaged in implicit bias training, and that's great. This poses amazing potential for remedying and minimizing police brutality against minority groups. So if we can get police trained in this way for implicit bias training, then we could really dramatically cut down on instances of police brutality, especially those surrounding race. However, only new recruits are really being trained in this way. In the vast majority of localities where police are doing the training, they're only doing it to the new guys. And so veteran officers are not being confronted with their implicit biases. That's not to say that they can't be confronted with their implicit biases, but they're not being, right? So those veteran officers may be being informally taught, and they may be training their subordinates to reject the implicit bias training because it doesn't match with their older worldviews. And that is the kind of thing we've been talking a lot about that kind of thing in this class up to this point, that when officers reject policy decisions, and when there are cultural issues on the micro level with police forces not following the instruction that happens on the macro level, then that can cause really serious problems. Okay, that is it for this time. I look forward to our work we're going to be doing around this. This is an incredibly valuable topic. It's an incredibly timely topic whenever we talk about it, and I really look forward to our conversations around this. Thanks.